Who is piloting the UAPs or UFOs constantly seen in our skies? Where are they from? Why are they here? How long have they been here? What is their mission on planet Earth? Do they come in peace, or do they have more sinister motives? Join Mad Mark as he uncovers the answers to these questions and many more of the mysteries that puzzle us all on Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. And now, here's Mad Mark. Today's episode, a deep dive into the Anunnaki that I like to call the warrior princess, Inanna Ishtar. And you are being controlled, and it's time to break out of the Matrix. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of Who Are the Aliens? The history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. I'm Mad Mark, and before I begin, just a reminder to please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. I would also like to mention that I have created a new Facebook page for the show. I put a link in the show description, so go ahead and follow me over there. I'm hoping that this will be a place where we can all gather to discuss each episode and where you can voice your comments and questions, so please check that out. Today we continue our studies of Zecharia Sitchin's third book, The Wars of Gods and Men, published by Avon Books in 1985. But first, I talk a lot on this program about false information being spread online regarding the Anunnaki. And it's true that it is becoming like a pandemic with all the crap currently being spread about them on the internet. And it's not just about the Anunnaki. You really have to be careful who you listen to for information about aliens in general these days. Everybody wants their 15 minutes of fame. And then there are those who claim things that simply can't be proven either way. One of these is a man by the name of Anka, who claims to be channeling an entity known as Ishtar. He's been doing this for some 40 years. He's very popular, and I'm sure that many of you have heard of him. I have personally listened to him several times. I have no idea if he's on the level or not, but occasionally he does make some very good points. And one of those is concerning the religions on this planet. I have talked in great depth about the fact that the Anunnaki are responsible for the creation of religions on our planet. Each god wanted his or her humans to worship them. They built temples and various other places of devotion in order to control their humans. Think about it. If you were the creator of the universe, you wouldn't need people worshiping you. What would be the point? But even if you did, you wouldn't create thousands of different religions. You would want everybody on the same page. Worship me like this. You wouldn't tell one group of people to do one thing and the next group of people something completely different and so on, because you would know in advance that this would lead to problems. People would be willing to fight and die for their God. Wars, hatred, profiling, and prejudice. Millions would die. Everyone thinking that the God ruling over the place of their birth was the correct one. How convenient is that? No, it's completely illogical. Even now, this very minute, the creator of the universe would have the power to wave his hand over the earth and get everybody on the same page. But it doesn't happen. It never has, and it never will. Because the creator of the universe didn't create these religions, the Anunnaki gods and humans did. That's why there are so many different faiths and so many different rules, regulations, and routines. What does all of this have to do with Anka, aka Ishtar? Well, in one of his videos, he spoke about this very thing. He said, quote, "If it wasn't for the fact that you actually had these kinds of encounters with extraterrestrial beings in your history, it is very unlikely you would actually have expressed your spirituality as you do today in the form of religion. It's actually a relatively rare thing that we have encountered on any other planet. That you actually have this kind of religious rituality surrounding your spirituality and your connection to creation. So it is primarily because of those interactions that it has been transformed down through the ages in a religious context. End quote. Is Bashar for real? Your guess is as good as mine. But in this instance, his words ring true. And that truth is that the Anunnaki created us and then in turn created religions as a means to control us, to separate us, and to keep us fighting each other in their name. No religious texts were written by the creator of the universe. They were written by men, powerful men, emperors, kings, religious leaders, handpicked by the Anunnaki at first, and by their descendants and or humans appointed by them later. People with something to gain by controlling what others believe. They decide which stories to change, which stories to alter, which stories to keep, and which ones to erase from history. They left out anything that gave the people too much freedom, too much power, or too much connection with the divine without needing them in the form of a church or a priest. Over time, these religious texts became less of a guide for the soul and more of a manual for control. They told people how to act, how to live, and how to obey. They told women to be silent. They told slaves to be loyal. They told the poor to wait for heaven while the rich and powerful reap the benefits of ruling earth now. And because these books were considered holy, people did not question them. But the truth is that entire books were destroyed. The spiritual texts that talked about heaven being within you, gone. The stories that depicted Jesus/Yeshua as a teacher, not a God demanding worship, gone. Teachings that empowered women, gone. Let's look at the Bible, for instance, a book whose Old Testament contained the very stories of the ancient Sumerian gods that I reference on this show, rewritten by Marduk to exclude the other Anunnaki gods, because thou shalt have no other gods before me. The book of Enoch, excluded because it contains encounters with the Anunnaki. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, excluded because it empowers women. This version of the Bible that we have today was rewritten and reworked for a reason, to shape the minds of the masses and to protect the power of the few. And if hearing all of this makes you feel uncomfortable, good, because that means that you are finally seeing through the dark veil and thinking for yourself, breaking out of their matrix. Okay, moving on. Time to hear from another entity from whom we are never sure if they are telling the truth or not. I'm speaking of governments, this time specifically the U.S. government. In the latest U.S. congressional hearings on UFOs/UAPs, we heard this statement, quote, "And it's something that's not gonna go away. So we just as well get in and learn as much about it as possible and let the public know what it is that we fight for," end quote. And where can you learn the truth about these aliens? Right here on this show. Okay, and in those same congressional hearings, we also heard this, and this one is much more urgent. Quote, "We're kind of preparing the U.S. population, at least by extension, the world population as well, into that reality that there is something, there is a presence here, and that we need to explain this presence, because if they show up and we continue to do what we did before previous decades and they show up, well, there will be mass panic. But if you understand that these are real and we have 5 years from 2022, or maybe now 4 years if they come in 2027, for the U.S. government to prepare the people about what is up there. And in many ways, I think the word got out within the government that they're showing up in 2027, and we better be prepared. And if not, there's going to be a lot of explaining to do. And so I think that dialogue has happened inside the government in certain areas inside the government that we need to prepare, and that's why in 2017 that set a clock of 10 years, and why Lou Elizondo earlier in this year said, just find a hobby for 5 years, it'll all be out in 5 years. And he said that this year, so that's 2027. And I would say I've heard 2027 in a kind of an official capacity that I can't reveal. So I think that I would say that people in the government are aware of something happening and that there's limited time. A few more years to prepare the people, and that's what's ramping up this acceleration from the previous 7 decades of not even acknowledging it to now we are acknowledging it at a faster and faster pace, end quote. Now that's obviously an older hearing, but it's still relevant, since according to them, we should have contact within the next 2 years. So now is probably a very good time to start listening to the older episodes of this program. You're going to want to learn as much as you can about these beings before they arrive. Now, what exactly will this contact bring, you may be asking? Well, there's really no way to know the exact truth about that, but we can speculate. One thing that might happen is that they will present us with a holographic history of humanity on Earth, something that everyone will have a chance to view. I don't know about you, but I would most certainly love to see which parts of history we have been taught to believe is true and which are complete BS. Yes, I would certainly enjoy seeing something like that. Now, there are many people on social media who are constantly preaching that contact with the aliens means that they are coming to save us. I say, unfortunately, I do not believe that at all. The Anunnaki are going to save us from what exactly? From themselves? They've been running everything from the shadows on this planet for thousands of years, so I don't believe they're just going to go away and leave us to our own fate. However, it could bring some major positive changes for planet Earth. Allow me to explain. Now, I don't know very much about the subject of astrology. It has never really interested me whatsoever. But the Anunnaki are into it big time. And I'll get into all of that when Mr. Sitchin covers that topic in the future. But here are a few things that I do remember from when I first read all of Mr. Sitchin's books back in the 90s. The main reason for Marduk's rise to power just prior to the great catastrophe that led to the mass Anunnaki exodus from Earth was because he claimed that we were entering the age of his astrological sign, which meant that it was his time to rule. Now, the other Anunnaki did not necessarily agree with his notion, which is why wars resulted. But he did indeed rise to power here on Earth. The good news is that we are now entering the age of Aquarius, the age which is expected to bring us significant social, political, and personal changes marked by a shift from individualistic pursuits to a greater emphasis on community and collective consciousness. It is said to be a time of transformation, interconnectedness, and a potential awakening for all of humanity. Sort of like my job on this show, to awaken you to the truth about what is and has been really going on our planet. Do I think that Marduk is just going to roll over and offer a nice, quiet transfer of power? Yeah, probably not. But a new ruler of our planet will be ushered in during this new age. And if I am remembering all of this correctly from my studies in the 90s, this new leader will be a female. Which one? Could it be just a coincidence that at this point in the book we are studying, Mr. Sitchin has decided to dedicate an entire chapter to none other than the warrior princess herself? I know. You're about to say that nobody in any of the ancient texts refers to her as the warrior princess, and that is absolutely true. I gave her that nickname myself because she reminds me so damn much of Xena. So let's find out a little about her now. Inanna Ishtar, mighty warrior, granddaughter of Enlil, and the only one besides Enki who ever had the balls to stand up to Marduk. You will remember me talking about her in earlier episodes. She fought in some of the earliest Anunnaki wars, and she stood up to Marduk for killing her husband and then attempted to have him imprisoned inside the Great Pyramid until he starved to death. The tale of Inanna, aka Ishtar, is a story of a self-made goddess. She was not one of the original olden gods that first settled here on Earth from the planet Nibiru, nor was she the firstborn daughter of any of those original Anunnaki astronauts. But despite all of this, she still somehow catapulted herself to the highest ranks to become a member of the Pantheon of 12. And she did so by combining cunning and beauty with ruthlessness. A goddess of both war and love, a lover of both gods and men. But although the death of her husband Dumuzi was indirectly caused by her desire to become a queen on Earth, the eventual imprisonment and exile of the culprit Marduk did little to satisfy her ambitions. And now, having won out in a battle with a major god, she felt entitled to have her own dominion to rule over. But where? Her first thoughts were to take advantage of an ancient Anunnaki law, which, oddly enough, eventually found its way into biblical marital and successional laws. It states that when a married man dies without having had a son or male heir, if he had a brother, then that brother is responsible for his widow, even if the brother is already married. The widow is not allowed to marry a stranger. It is up to the man's brother to marry his sister-in-law and have children by her. And it just so happened that Dumuzi's funeral was set to take place near the Land of Mines in South Africa, which makes perfect sense since Dumuzi was a son of Enki and South Africa had been Enki's domain. And it was now the domain of Inanna Ishtar's sister, Ereshkigal, who, just coincidentally, was married to Dumuzi's brother, Nergal. Now you may be saying, but as the eldest of Enki's sons, wouldn't Marduk be the brother responsible for the widowed Inanna Ishtar? Well, in a perfect world, the answer would be yes. But seeing as how Marduk was indirectly responsible for Dumuzi's death, and as a result had been sentenced to exile, you can see where that might be a problem. No, that wouldn't work at all. But the next eldest brother, Nergal, who just happened to be married to Inanna's sister, the same sister who was the current goddess ruling over South Africa, yes, that would work out quite nicely indeed. So, Inanna Ishtar headed to South Africa for the funeral. Now, you might expect that a reunion between two sisters would be a heartwarming and loving event, especially when you factor in that one of these sisters had just lost her husband and was there to attend his funeral. But that was not the case. Upon arriving in the domain of her sister, Inanna was immediately arrested by 7 Anunnaki judges and sentenced to be hung from the stake. It seems that Ereshkigal was more than aware of the Anunnaki laws regarding the responsibility of the brother towards the grieving widow, and she wanted no part of it. She had figured out the goddess's plans and was more than ready to put an end to them before Inanna even set foot in her kingdom. I've mentioned many times on this show that there was no love lost between the Anunnaki when it came to matters of the heart and to ruling over kingdoms. It was only by the intervention of Enki that Inanna Ishtar was eventually saved, and thus, her plans foiled, Inanna returned to Mesopotamia. But what now? Where would she ever find her own kingdom to rule over? Remember in past episodes I mentioned that after the Great Flood, the Anunnaki began the rebuilding process, first in Sumeria, then in Egypt, and finally in the Indus Valley region. Now, since then, I've talked a lot about the first two locations, but I haven't said much about the Indus Valley. Well, to make a long story short, that is where Inanna Ishtar chose to go. Not completely, of course. She wanted to keep one foot firmly planted in her homeland of Mesopotamia, but she became a sort of commuting god, flying back and forth in her boat of heaven between her Mesopotamian home in Erech and her new kingdom of Arata in the Indus Valley. But Erech was still a provincial city, meaning that unlike the other established Mesopotamian cities, it lacked the status and the benefits associated with possession of the divine Mies. Remember a few episodes back I talked about how after the Second Pyramid War, Enlil had demanded that Enki share these Mies with larger established Mesopotamian cities? Now, for any listeners who may not have heard those earlier episodes, although you really should go back and listen to them, let's define what these Mies are exactly. They were similar to today's computer chips, on which data, programs, and operational orders had been recorded. And the information they contained was basically the essentials for civilization. But, as I said at this point, Inanna's city of Erech did not have any Mies, which meant it had no status. Basically, it was considered to be a minor city, and Inanna Ishtar desperately wanted to change that fact. Enki was the god in charge of the Mies on planet Earth. If you wanted any, you had to go through him. And that's exactly what Inanna did. And she used her feminine charms in order to do it. She used her flying boat of heaven to journey to the Abzu, or South Africa, to pay a visit to Enki. Upon hearing of her visit and that she was coming alone, Enki ordered his chamberlain to prepare a sumptuous meal, complete with plenty of date wine. After the feast had been consumed, Enki was quite drunk, and that was when Inanna chose to bring up the subject of the Mies. Being basically drunk off his ass, he presented her with the Me for lordship, godship, the exalted and enduring tiara, and the throne of kingship. And as Inanna continued to charm her aging host into an inebriated stupor, Enki then gave her the exalted scepter and staff, the exalted shrine, and righteous rulership. And Inanna took them all. In total, Enki ended up gifting her with 7 major Mies, embracing the functions and attributes of a divine lady, her temple and rituals, its priests, eunuchs and prostitutes, warfare and weapons, justice and courts, music and arts, masonry, woodworking, metalworking, leatherwork and weaving, scribeship and mathematics, and so on and so on. And so, with the Mies in her possession and Enki passed out drunk, Inanna boarded her flying boat of heaven and took off for her home in Erech. Hours later, when Enki had sobered up, he realized what he had done, that Inanna was gone, and so were his Mies. He quickly ordered his chamberlain to pursue Inanna in Enki's great heavenly sky chamber and retrieve them. Inanna must not have been flying very quickly, nor with any real sense of urgency, because, even with a few hours' head start, Enki's chamberlain was able to catch up to her at the first stopping point in Eridu. I am assuming that this was some sort of refueling station. The chamberlain confronted Inanna and explained his orders from Enki to retrieve the Mies. Upon hearing this, Inanna replied, "Why has Enki changed his word to me?" She secretly instructed her pilot to fly her ship back to Erech with the Mies while she kept Enki's chamberlain busy by arguing with him. And that is exactly what happened. And this plan must have worked, because that is the end of what the ancient texts relate to us about these events. But that was when Inanna Ishtar was incorporated as a member of the Pantheon of 12, and under her leadership, Erech thrived. and Inanna Ishtar was honored and worshipped by the citizens of Erech from that time forward. At this point in the book, Mr. Sitchin dives into Inanna's various trysts with her appointed kings through the years. Apparently, the male Anunnaki were not the only ones who were horny. And then we learn about an ill-conceived attempt by her to conquer some land in the Sinai Peninsula. Basically, all that accomplished was to piss off her grandfather Enlil. It's all an interesting read, but for our purposes here, I'm going to skip all of that. The book then delves into the exodus of the Jews from Egypt Kemet. Again, interesting enough to read, but not very translatable for a show such as this. But the next topic covered is the history of Abraham, the patriarch of the Jewish, Christian, and Islamic faiths. On an earlier episode, I talked about the fact that he was born in Ur, a Sumerian city. But why did he leave Sumeria? And was he somehow involved in the tragedy that caused the mass exodus of the Anunnaki from planet Earth? As it turns out, there was a lot more to his story than we read in the Bible. You'll be shocked and amazed to discover the true history of Abraham, and I will begin covering all of that on my next episode. And that is where I leave you for this episode. You have quite a lot to digest there, and we have so much more to cover and learn. I'm Mad Mark, and I sincerely hope that you have enjoyed this episode. If so, please like, share, and comment. It helps so much. And also tell your friends and help spread the word about this show. Also, if you have any questions regarding the content discussed on this program, just message me through madmarktv.com or on any of my social media platforms. I also wish to remind everyone that listening to this podcast is no excuse to not read the book that we are discussing here, The Wars of Gods and Men by Zecharia Sitchin. It is an amazing work, and I am leaving out much information in order to keep the show flowing properly. So do yourselves a favor and read that book. Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth is written and produced by me, Mad Mark. Today we have taken another step in our ongoing journey to find the truth. I promise you that things will get more and more interesting the further we delve into this topic of who are the aliens, the history of the Anunnaki on planet Earth. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Who Are the Aliens? The History of the Anunnaki on Planet Earth with your host, Mad Mark. Join us again on our next program when Mad Mark will once again uncover the answers to the mysteries that puzzle mankind.